Hey guys, welcome to lesson 2 of chapter 14, the global age, focusing on Europe, Asia, and Africa. So today we are going to be talking about the turbulent centuries of Africa. I hope that you all enjoyed yesterday's lesson. I'm going to start trying to maybe incorporate a couple other creative ways in some upcoming videos. And because I know you're all very worried about it, we are still going to have Fun Fact Friday on Friday. But for today, we just have a little bit of information to get through. And then you have a Junopod assignment just like yesterday. Now, this Junopod is ever so slightly longer. It's a couple of questions that, of course, we're going to go over. But then it's a short reading, like one little paragraph, a couple questions about that. And then it does ask you for a short, like 6 sentence just creative response to some of the information today. So you'll see all of that. As always, feel free to email, call, text me if you have any questions, okay? I'm here for you guys, and I miss being in the classroom with you guys. But, you know, we do what we can for now, okay? So with that being said, let's get started. We're going to talk about Africa. So we are mostly going to be talking about Portugal today. However, unfortunately, sorry guys, we're not going to be talking about the Portuguese in Brazil. We're going to be talking about the Portuguese influence in the continent of Africa. So the Portuguese, as we learned yesterday, are the first ones that are going out and exploring out of the Europeans because they're the most stable. And they had Prince Henry, who was all like, yes, go forth and explore all the time, and who actually paid for people to learn how to explore. And so that's why the Portuguese have kind of a leg up on everybody else in this instance. Now, the Portuguese were also looking for a sea route to Asia. And they didn't want to go through the Mediterranean because by the time we get to the 1400s, the Mongol Empire is falling. You've got these Arabs, the Ottoman Empire, which is not very friendly to European trade. And so they can no longer cross through the Middle East to get to Asia. And so they're looking for ways to go around. And so they go around Africa. But Africa is really, really, really big. And so while they're working around Africa to get to Asia, they realize that there's so much stuff in Africa that they can look at as well. And so the Portuguese begin carrying out this strategy of buying goods directly from the source. Because when they buy, so usually the Portuguese would go to the Arabs, okay? So you would have Europeans who would go to the Arabs to buy African and Asian goods. Now, let's imagine that you wanted to walk to Walmart, okay? And you were like, okay, I'm going to walk to Walmart and I'm going to go buy a cup of coffee. And I'm also going to buy, or this is very relevant for all of you, I'm going to go buy a Monster at Wawa, okay? Now, so let's say that one of you decides to walk down to Wawa to buy a Monster. And as we know, everyone is going to say, oh, here, can you get me one? I'll pay you back. Now, the person who's doing the walking to Wawa might say, I don't want to walk all this way and carry all these monsters if I'm not getting something out of it. So what I'm going to do is instead of charging you Wawa's price for Monster, I'm going to add 50 cents. So let's say Monsters are $1.50. They're going to say, if you give me $2, I'll go buy you a Monster. That's kind of what the Europeans are doing with the Arabs. The Arabs are the ones who are going to get the Monster, and the Europeans are the ones who are having to pay more money because otherwise it's not worth the Arabs' time, right? The Arabs are saying, I'm spending all this time going to get these goods from Africa and Asia, so I'm going to charge you a little extra. But the Europeans say, well, we don't want to go through the Arabs anymore. We want to go directly to the source. Because, again, with our Monster analogy, if you walk directly to Wawa, then you would be paying $1.50 for their Monster. But if you buy it from whoever makes the run, then you might have to pay $2. So it's cheaper to go from the source. Does that make sense? So the Europeans are going to the Arabs for Asian and African goods, but they want to cut out the middleman to pay less for all of their goods, okay? So the Portuguese now are starting to establish trading ports along the coast of Africa because, as we said, Africa is a really, really big country. And if you are trying to go all the way around Africa, you're going to have to stop for provisions. You can't pack enough food to make it the whole time. You will probably die. And so the Portuguese are establishing trading posts to trade for gold, hides, like different animal hides, ivory, and slaves. These were not just colonial, these were not colonies. The Portuguese weren't there trying to rule the Africans. They were just there trying to trade, okay? So the Portuguese set up these trading posts in Africa. Trading posts, not colonies. They are not in charge. Now, from West Africa, the Portuguese are sailing all the way around the continent, continuing to establish forts and trading posts. But they also are attacking now Eastern African coastal cities such as Mombasa and Malindi. Okay? So now they're not just trading, they're also attacking places like Mombasa and Malindi, which are these international trading posts. Why attack an international trading post? Well, because you want to control the international trade. Basically what they did was they attacked the trading posts, and then they expelled all of the Arabs that were living in the trading posts, and they took over and they said, we're going to control international trade now. Each conquest adds to this growing trade empire that they've got. Okay. Now, over the next 2 centuries, some Portuguese explorers managed to reach parts of present-day Congo, Zambia, Zimbabwe. They're all establishing this limited trade. However, for the most part, the Portuguese are not going inland. They're mostly staying on the coast. Quite frankly, they don't have the maps or other resources that they need to survive that exploration. They stick to their ships and they just look at the coasts. Now, I did say that they were trading in slaves. So let's talk about the slave trade. Now, Europeans did have slaves before this, but they weren't necessarily Africans, and they weren't necessarily divvied up by the color of anybody's skin. Most of their slaves before this were prisoners of war. So if 2 nations would go to war, then they might keep spoils of war, prisoners of war as slaves. But also during the Black Death, you don't really have a place for many slaves. Quite frankly, too many Europeans are dying to worry about taking care of another human. But now your African slave trade is expanding. Now, Africans also kept slaves. There was slavery in Africa. Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, Persians, Indians, and Aztecs all often enslaved defeated foes. So the English word slave actually comes from Slav. Okay, so slave comes from the word Slav, which is a nationality, like a Slavic or a heritage, and it comes from this large number of large number of Slavs taken to work for Russia at the time. And so the word slave actually doesn't even come from anything stemming from skin color. The word slave comes from a group of Slavic people, which are all Eastern European, that were enslaved in Russia. But Europeans are now starting to enter the African slave trade. Portuguese traders are quickly joining the profitable slave trade, and Europeans bought a large number of slaves to perform labor on their plantations. Okay? So a plantation is a large estate run by an owner or an overseer. And these plantations are usually in the Americas because there's not as much room in Europe. So plantations need slaves because the people didn't want to pay for work. You just wanted to buy a slave and then make the slave work because plantations are so big and they take so much work. So these are usually in the Americas. So these are really, really wealthy people who are purchasing slaves, shipping them to America, and forcing them to work there. Europeans really never are the ones going to get the slaves. Europeans are mostly buying the slaves as exotic servants, or they're buying them from Africans who have already captured other Africans. So African rulers and traders are actually the ones going into the nation, seizing captives, and bringing them to the coastal trading ports. Okay, so usually it's African lords raiding internal cities to capture slaves. Now, please note that this is in the 1400s. This participation does change, and Europeans do start raiding Africa and kidnapping and capturing slaves. However, very early on in the 1400s, it's mostly your local regional African rulers who are trying to make a profit for themselves, and so they're going deeper into the continent to capture people. Now, why would the local African lords be raiding internal cities to capture their own people? Money and goods. They would bring them to coastal trading ports and forts and exchange them for textiles, so like cloth or clothing, metalwork, rum, tobacco, weapons, gunpowder. And over the next 300 years, lots of businesses want this cheap labor, and so the slave trade expands. The slaves are considered to be property. And this is where that transition happens to these slaves being commodities that can be bought and sold and traded, instead of just what happens if you got captured at the end of war. Okay, now some African leaders resist. Okay, so you've got this guy, Afonso I, who's a ruler of Congo. And yes, Congo, the Old Kingdom is spelled with a K. He's the ruler of Congo, and as a young man, he had been tutored by Portuguese missionaries. So missionary, someone who wants to convert someone to a religion, who were hoping to convert Africans to Christianity. After becoming king in 1505, he called on the Portuguese to help him develop Congo as a Christian state. So Afonso of Congo, he was raised Christian, and he was raised by the Portuguese. And so he was very upset about the slave trade, because he was like, we're a Christian nation. Christians shouldn't be doing this, and it's my people. And so he appealed to the Portuguese to prevent the slave trade, and they would not. Afonso wanted to maintain contact with Europe because you've got all these Portuguese who are coming to his country to buy his people as slaves. And so as much as he's begging and pleading for this not to happen, the Portuguese don't listen. In the late 1700s, you have another African ruler who tries to halt the slave trades. He was the Almani of Futa. And so Almani meaning like religious leader, and Futa Toro, which was in Senegal. Now, in Futa Toro, it was more the French instead of the Portuguese who were capturing, and he tried to forbid anyone to transport slaves, but they simply went around him. And so you do have these African leaders that are saying, we don't want slavery, but the Europeans are not listening, because it's quite frankly just too profitable. It gives them too much money. Now, some new African states. Africa is also developing, and not just through European intervention. The Africans were quite able to develop on their own. Thank you very much. So the slave trade does, though, have major effects, because in West Africa, you have a lot of young women who are being kidnapped, and young men who are being kidnapped and disappearing forever. These are young people. These are supposed to be your next generation, but they're being kidnapped and they're being taken away. So things are changing. But you do have these new states. So one of those new states is the Asante Kingdom. So the Asante Kingdom emerged in present-day Ghana, and in the late 1600s, you have this military leader, Osei Tutu, O-S-E-I, and then T-U-T-U, who ends up being able to unite, as we've seen so many times before. You have this young military leader who's able to unite the people around him, conquer some neighboring peoples, and unite it into a kingdom. Now, they are easily challenged, and Osei Tutu realizes that in order to basically win and withstand this external force, he needs to unite his people. And so he needs to figure out a way to get all the people to follow him. And the way that you get people to follow you is not say, I'm bigger than you and stronger than you, so listen to me. Try that, see how well it works. No, what he does is he needs to figure out a reason why the people want to follow him. And so he claims the right to rule came from heaven. He says that God gave him the right to rule, and that the people in the kingdom are linked by these spiritual bonds. This fostered a growing sense of unity, and so the people were actually able to come together, unite, and withstand and actually defeat their enemies. Under him, under Tutu, he was choosing government officials by merit rather than by birth, which is a very good thing. Okay, you always want your officials to be qualified in what they're doing, instead of just saying, well, my dad did it. Right? We've talked about that before. So you don't want to go into the same job as your parents just because you're their kid, right? Now, they manage a royal monopoly on gold mining and on the slave trade. Okay? So a monopoly, if you've ever played the never-ending game that one of my roommates is now attempting to force the house into because of quarantine. He says, now that we have so much time, we can all play Monopoly. I hate that game. Anyways, a monopoly is when you have full control over something. And so Tutu establishes a monopoly on gold and on slaves. When you have a monopoly, you can charge whatever you want because you're making all the profits and nobody else is selling anything. And so they're trading with the Europeans, golden slaves, and they're getting firearms. Now, if you're the only kingdom in Africa with a gun, you're going to be the most powerful. And so this worked well for them. Now, another empire was the Oyo Empire. O-Y-O. Oyo Empire. And the Oyo Empire arose from successive waves of settlement by the Yoruba people of present-day Nigeria. Okay, so this is the Yoruba people from present-day Nigeria. The Yoruba began as a small forest kingdom, but it actually grew into a full empire and began to trade with European merchants as well. Now, European presence expands. This is the end. We're almost done, guys. So, following the Portuguese example, by 1600, several other European powers are saying, well, they're getting rich. I want some of this too. And so they're jumping on board. One of those is the Dutch. And the Dutch were different than the Portuguese in that the Portuguese are only setting up trading posts. They're not actually really going into Africa. The Dutch, however, planning on establishing permanent footholds and colonies. Okay? So the Dutch are working on permanent settlements, which is a much bigger deal because they're going to be there a lot more. The first permanent European settlement in Africa was Cape Town, and that was built in 1652 down south. It was settled by Dutch farmers called Boers. Okay, no, not a D. Sorry, B-O-E-R-S. Those are Dutch farmers. And no, they were not named that because they're boring. But those were people that they started out just as farming, but then they started using religious superiority, saying that we're Christian, we're chosen by God. We are going to start looking at the Africans as inferior. And they're saying, well, you're not Christian, you aren't chosen by God, and so you don't actually own this land. And so this is one of the beginnings with the Boers of people beginning to look at Africans as inferior. And this is where that cultural disconnect starts to happen. By the mid-1600s, the British and the French are both having presences in Africa as well, sponsoring explorations, all of this stuff, really trying to each claim their piece of the very wealthy puzzle that is Africa. And this is where it starts. This is where you have the beginning of saying Africans aren't Christian. Africans aren't educated the way we are. Africans aren't superior to us. In fact, they're inferior. And so they don't deserve this land. We do. It's the same mentality that the Europeans are taking to the Native Americans as well. And it's very, very toxic. But this is where it starts. Okay? So this should be everything that you need to be able to complete your Junopod. Please get creative with the last question. I love seeing your responses. I'll zoom in on the whiteboard for a moment. If I don't, oh dear, I just erased a little bit of it. But I'll just make sure that you get it all. That way you get a chance to read all of it. And yeah, so good luck with your Junopod. Let me know if you guys have any questions. You guys are awesome. I hope you're having a fantastic day. Bye.